Your life journey doesn't stand still, and neither should your wealth. Welcome to Wealth on the Move, the podcast. Will Hoffman offers investment advice through Private Advisor Group, which is a federally registered investment advisor. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult with the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. All right, welcome back to another episode of Wealth on the Move, the podcast. I'm Will Hoffman, founder and president of Hoffman Wealth Management, and your host. And today we have Dr. Naomi Win, a behavior financial analyst with Orion. And we're going to talk a lot about, uncertainty when it comes to our money and why we behave the way we do during uncertainty, how to overcome those, unfortunately negative behaviors that typically happen during periods of uncertainty. Some steps forward whenever we are feeling anxious about our money and things happening around our money, and not just the markets, but all types of decisions and environments around our money. So Dr. Win, welcome to Wealth on the Move, the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So can you give our listeners first a bit of a background about you, and then help us understand what a behavioral financial analyst does?
Yeah, definitely. As far as it goes for me, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist and also in school psychology. So I've worked in school systems, I've worked in private practice, and I've kept in contact with a couple of different people who ended up in finance over the course of my career. And just in conversation, I think we started to realize some of the issues that we would, we're kind of comparing professional trajectories between finance and private practice. We started to notice a lot of similar things happening. And by that, I mean people who are experiencing distress or needing clarity and being concerned that they're getting in their own way and needing somebody else to be there to help guide them to find the conclusion that they're really after. And that was showing up both in clinical work and in finance. And so at some point I switched over and joined finance to apply some similar skills to people navigating their finances. So the behavioral analyst is a couple of different things. When we're looking at the way that the cognitive and emotional drivers that we all have pair up together in ways that are advantageous to our financial decision making, and then also not particularly advantageous. And then how do we minimize those things? How do we kind of mitigate the risks that we pose to our own well-being when it comes to our material life?
Okay, so if I could summarize that, and please tell me if I'm wrong, make sure we're thinking with our brains and not our bellies when it comes to our money.
Yeah, although I think at some point, I'm sure we'll get to this at some point too. I think behavioral finance is very interested in taking that exact approach. What is rational makes sense because the market is not, there's a certain sentiment aspect to the market for sure. But to make the best decision in that, you mainly need to be working in a rational mode. So I think that does make a lot of sense. However, I would put a bit of a different take on that in some ways, that we don't want to work at the expense of our emotions. We don't want to minimize those or suppress them or ignore them. They are really valid data points and they're important to take on board. I just don't think they should be in the driver's seat. That's all.
Okay. That's a great explanation. So why does financial uncertainty affect us so much? It seems like, and obviously we're just coming through a period of some market volatility and some market uncertainty. And it seems as though at different times, different types of uncertainty affects folks in different ways. But why is it so impactful?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think when we think about uncertainty, it's just, I'm just not sure what to do. But why does that particular I'm not sure what to do lead to such an incredible pendulum swing in terms of how you make good decisions? But someone who's like incredibly rational, uncertainty can be a catalyst for them suddenly becoming incredibly emotional and very like rash instead
Sure.
of being irrational. It's quite an interesting catalyst. I think there are a couple of ways to answer this question. We could look at it on a neurological level, how that impacts us. We could look at a childhood history manuscript level, lots of ways to approach this. But at the root of those things, I think what's happening is that uncertainty is remarkably scary to us because it threatens our well-being. So financial uncertainty really impacts our ability to see financial security, material well-being, and all of those things in the contemporary way that we live as humans. It impacts our ability to actualize what we're hoping for. It impacts our ability to, if we think about our futures, all of that, when we think about our dreams and hopes of the futures, it all relies on having the means to make it happen. or the means to insulate and buffer ourselves against the things we're scared of. Money and emotion and well-being, these things are all, intrinsically tied together. And so when we're uncertain about the future, when we can't see a pattern, when we're not sure what comes next, our very pattern-making brains go into overdrive, and we equate that with a physical risk, essentially. And so I think financial security, financial uncertainty affects us so much because it feels like a physical threat.
Yeah, and I guess my next question, and mostly, what have folks like Warren Buffett have learned to either, and have to imagine that they're anxious the same times that we are, that there's a level of uncertainty at the same, maybe not the same degree that the rest of us are operating in, but what have they done to be able to suppress that or tune into that better than the average saver, the average investor, and average retiree?
Yeah, I like this question. And I like the way that you phrase the idea that what do we do to either suppress it or tune into it? And I think the first thing we have to do is recognize those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum of how we typically deal with uncertainty or anything that causes us pain, things that we don't like. So I think, we're uncomfortable with something. Some personalities tend to move towards suppress it, repress it, don't talk about it, don't look at it, ignore the whole thing. And
Right.
that leads to its own kind of set of problems. The other side is that we really tune into it and we overly tune into it, and now it's directing everything we do. So if we think about this, if you don't mind me drawing on clinical practice, if I have somebody in my office for kind of clinical practice and they're experiencing uncertainty or ambivalence around a relationship, for example,
Okay.
or don't know if they should change jobs, if they suppress their feelings about it and just make a cold, hard decision, in that moment, I think there's a little bit of immediate relief. They don't have to deal with those emotions. But at some point, the emotions catch up, and that's when they can derail things. The other person, on the other hand, if they're very anxious and all they do is tune into their emotions, they're going to be all over the place. Whatever
Right.
tide comes in, they're going to be all over. So I do like to think about it, since I've started talking about sea analogies, I do like to think about it in that sense, that if we think about the ups and downs of the market and the kind of emotional ups and downs that come with that, those are sort of like the tides and the waves. We don't really have any control over how that happens. It's
Right.
going to happen. It's going to go up, it's going to go down. We're probably going to feel a little bit up and down, and that's all fine and well. That's what happens when you're at sea. The thing that we can do, though, is figure out two things. We need to get a rudder, we need a sail, we need to learn how to sail, and then we need to figure out a destination. And those are the things that are kind of within the space that we navigate. So I think, to answer your question, long way to answer your question, I apologize, is I think
No, it's
people,
it's
oh, it's
your
helpful.
answer is actually tying right into our process here, and I'll explain that in a second.
Oh, I'd love to hear about that. Yeah, I think, it's just that, pick your North Star, figure out, in terms of, goals-based wealth management, for example, figure out your risk composure, things like that. Get your rudder in the water, acknowledge that the tides are coming, acknowledge that maybe they're a little scary, and then refocus on what you need to do to keep moving in the right direction despite those things. I think that's maybe what people are doing to navigate this.
Yeah, because I mean, the easy answer from me and my peers is always, listen, these things happen. You just have to ride it out and wait through it. And I don't know that that ever calms anyone down. Maybe in the moment on the phone, but later on that night when they can't sleep because they can't take it anymore, that's not really that soothing. And then we try to direct them back to their overall plan, back to their overall mission. To me, that's the most effective, is revisiting. And we have something here called the navigation formula, which is the process that we work with our clients through. And we approach it like a GPS. We need to know the two most important pieces of information: where you are now and where do you want to go. And through the middle, there's always going to be a level of uncertainty, just like there is when you're traveling down the road. What do we do if there's a traffic jam? What do we do if there's a crash in front of us that closes the road? I have 3 kids. What do we do if they have to go to the bathroom, need something to eat? How are we going to reroute this when it happens? And, we don't panic then. We just trust the GPS.
Yeah.
And to us, that financial GPS becomes just as effective
Yeah.
and creates that calming sense of, okay, yeah, yes, the market's down 10%, or worse. Yes, you've lost your job. Yes, there's other elements of finance. The breadwinner has passed away. Things like that are real financial uncertainty. because, we know historically the market is always going to have periods of volatility. They're never more comfortable than they were the last time. And the next time is going to be just as uncomfortable, if not more than this time. But other things like job loss, like, death, things like that, revisiting that plan and either crafting a new way forward or realizing that the path forward is still alive and well. And yes, let's harness that uncertainty, but understand that we are still moving in the direction that's helpful and productive and putting you in the best position for success. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Wealth on the Move, the podcast, brought to you by Hoffman Wealth Management. Here at Hoffman Wealth Management, we focus on working with busy families and active retirees, helping them navigate the complicated scenarios of their wealth while building the life that they desire. And we believe that every financial journey deserves direction. That is exactly what our proprietary process, the HWM navigation formula, provides. Just like a GPS, our navigation formula begins with two key questions. Where are you now? What does your financial picture currently look like? And where do you want to go? What goals and dreams do you have? From there, we help you navigate every financial turn en route to your desired destination with clarity and confidence. It's more than a plan, it's a personalized path forward. If you want to learn more on how the navigation formula can work for you, reach out through the contact options in the show notes below. We would love to help you chart your next move. Now, back to this episode of Wealth on the Move, the podcast.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because that's another thing I found in my work is helpful too, is talk about that road analogy. So the idea would be, I guess, it applies directly to what you're saying is, you want to go from A to B, you find a road that goes from A to B, and there's lines on the road to keep you on the road. If you're driving on the road and foggy conditions happen, to suddenly decide, oh, that means I need to go off-road and just off-roading to figure out my destination, you're not going to end up at B. You're not going to end up at point B. You've changed the end point. And so trying to find a new road that has no fog, well, the chances of that are kind of slim anyway. It's a bit of a dice roll. But the thing that you have taken off the table is that you will definitely get to point B. And the idea is that, trust those lines on the road that were painted when it wasn't foggy, and you just stay on track.
That's a tremendous analogy.
It's funny though, right? Because it sounds sort of simplistic, but there's some truth to it. I think if you are certain that B is your destination, then it's interesting.
Yeah, but when I think back to 2008, when banks are shuttering their doors, those lines on the road become meaningless to so many people. And,
absolutely.
All of a sudden it's calamity, and what do we do? And after 22 years, that's still the worst. It's kind of, I don't want to minimize anybody's, reaction to uncertainty, but we see tariffs, for example. And yes, they're uncertain. Yes, they're uncomfortable, but banks aren't closing their doors. And, we've come through so much that has been more significant in the past than what we're in this moment. So I guess my next question is what makes us forget that listen, things have been worse. Things are going to be bad again, especially when it comes to financial markets. Why do we forget that in that moment when we can't sleep at night, or when we see the news and the headlines are this time it's getting us more uncomfortable than in the past?
I think there are so many ways to answer this question. Let's take, for example, someone who has been in a loving, healthy marriage for 20 years.
Okay.
And they get into a fight about something, as people do.
Sure.
And it's uncomfortable. And in that moment, when somebody's feeling that emotion of kind of anger, that 20 years of a loving relationship where life has been built or whatever else, that means less for just a second enough for them to make a cutting remark. That in the right frame of mind, they would never say such a thing. Sure. And now they have to apologize and kind of go through all this kind of stuff and work through it. So I think, that flash of emotion, things like anger, fear, sadness, grief, these things can cause us to completely lose track of what our normal principles are. And this feeling of uncertainty, I think, is just as strong, if not stronger, than all of those other emotions. We know that from research, uncertainty is an emotion. I think we think of uncertainty as like a state of being for decision making, but it's more aligned with an emotion.
Okay.
And it's an emotion.
Because we're uncertain when we ask, or somebody immediately asks, where do you want to go to eat for dinner? And you don't know.
Uncertainty. Yeah.
You're not panicking and deciding not to eat.
Right, exactly. You're not frozen by that. You're not going into avoidance mode. You're not being super aggressive about it. So uncertainty, I think, it's on the spectrum, but we kind of forget that it's a strong emotional state. And it's interesting you put it in that. Say, for example, this morning when you decide what to get dressed for the day, you're thinking about function, you're thinking about the weather maybe, or what kind of things you have to do that day. In order to make a decision to go from uncertain to decided, you are thinking about anticipating what might happen in the day. So uncertainty handled, no problem. But what happens if you're uncertain and you can't anticipate what happens next? Now what happens? That's when all these other things start to come up. This is when uncertainty becomes that catalyst. And research has shown that human beings, we prefer certain pain to the uncertainty of whether or not we're going to be in pain,
Yeah.
which is kind of incredible if you think about it, that a human would rather know 100% I'm going to get hurt here than maybe I have a 50-50 chance of getting hurt. On paper, logistically, you'd think, well, it's 50-50. That's better than 100, right? And we prefer that, but we really don't. We're just so worried about it. So I think one of the reasons why we just lose our ability to kind of have our feet on the ground and stay rooted is because of the sense of threat that it brings in. But on top of that, we're just surrounded by so much, what I guess I call that culture of immediacy, where everything from our media to our smartphones, everything's designed around having instant feedback. So stimulus, feedback, stimulus, feedback. So when that's part of our culture, and you mentioned you have kids, I'm sure you're starting to kind of, you see this when you have a toddler, that's natural,
I was
right?
just thinking of that when you said immediate, certain pain.
Yeah.
Unless you're holding a 2-year-old that's about to get his round of shots, they
Yep.
don't want to experience that certain pain by any means.
Absolutely not. And I mean that this is a really good way of thinking about it. So as a small child, stimulus, freak out. That's it. That
Right.
it goes from A to B very, very quickly. And the thing we learn as we get older is that sometimes we have to experience the stimulus, recognize that we're experiencing the immediate reaction, but we don't react based on that reaction, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
we need to be, we have stimulus, internal reaction, and then we bring in reason. And that's part of maturing. And I think it's, when it comes to the market, we're talking about these really ancient wired brains that we're applying in a very modern context that really has no relation to each other. We have to fight against our nature in some ways to navigate it properly. So I think to answer that question, we have this culture that says, someone tweets something at you that you don't like, you just immediately clap back.
Right.
You are hungry, go on your app and get something delivered to your door immediately. Everything's immediate. What we have to remember is that's on purpose. Like this is by design. And so when we think about the market, we think about talking heads on TV or Facebook sidebars, whatever it is. The market's up and down. They're getting clicks, they're getting hits, they're
Right.
getting
I
paid
mean, their
by
job
us.
is to make us feel those feelings.
100%, absolutely. The whole job is to stimulate extreme feelings in us, so that we feel more engaged, because we know that when we're at that level of emotional excitement and arousal, we're more tuned in. We're
Yeah.
more. If we think about our ancient brains, for example, thinking, "Did I just see a predator over there?" Now all of our senses are super alert. We're super engaged. We're focused on the thing. If the news or whatever can make us feel that way, we're going to tune in a little bit more. And guess
Sure.
what? Guess who that benefits? So I think that's another part of it too, is that we're encouraged to be very immediate. So we have to be really purposeful and deliberate about countering that with practices that resist immediacy, to retreat into that mental space of, okay, the stimulus is a tariff that seems scary to me. My reaction is I'm uncertain and I'm scared, but my reasonable brain needs to kick in and say, what next?
Yeah.
If we simply just let our reactions take the reins on everything, we're going to be a disaster.
Well, and it's a great segue to my next question. When we are feeling that uncertainty, that anxiety, we kind of tie into our money scripts or our learned comfortable behavior. And the only thing I can think of is this: I can take as many lessons from a coach. I run marathons. If I am working with my coach and trying to work on my form, that's all well and good. But when I get tired, and when I need that form the most, I tend to kind of drift back to the wrong form, but because it's what I know, it's what I'm comfortable with. I'm assuming money scripts, the same thing's happening. Is okay, I know that, the financial channels are showing their breaking news, markets in turmoil. And, when that happens, Warren Buffett's laughing and looking to buy. But I'm losing sleep and nauseous and tuning in and so we're resorting to that level of, okay, it's more comfortable to worry than it is to do what discipline tells me.
Yeah. I think two main ways I would address that. The first is has to do with what we call psychological flexibility in clinical practice that directly applies. So that's part of that. And I think the second part of that would be to embrace what maybe opens for you. I think if we're extremely fixed on certainty, we end up settling for suboptimal outcomes, which sounds so paradoxical, but it is true. And I can explain what I mean by that. What you mentioned there is entirely it. I think it is true that we can afford to the level of our systems. If we have a baseline function of operation, we can do all the work we want and we can be working as our best selves and our rational minds. But when challenged with something that depletes our kind of psychological energy, we're more inclined to fall to the level of our systems. So if we think about this in terms of, again, I'll draw on private practice. If somebody really struggles with some kind of traumatic thing that's happened to them in a relationship, and they leave the relationship, they heal, they process, they grow, they do all these things, they feel amazing, they're all self-possessed. And then they get back into a relationship where the same challenges come up because that's what happens. There is a huge risk they will fall to the level of their systems. They'll have done all this work and they'll be so disappointed because they're like, how is this thing still coming up for me? What happens is that if it's a relationship where they can practice and do the work in the relationship, that's when you'll see the improvement. So with running, for example, the more often you encounter that tired state and you're mindful, oh, wait, I'm slipping back into my old habits, the more you can actually, that's the active space for the work. And I think the same is true with finances. So if we recognize, oh, I have a bit of a proclivity to do X, Y, Z when I'm feeling uncertain, when the market's calm and fine and you say, oh, I'm healed, I'm fine, I make all the right decisions now, you won't know that till you're tested again in a period of
Right.
volatility. If you can now reframe that period of volatility as like, oh, here's my active working ground, here's my growth edge, here's a chance for me to prove to myself that I've changed by choosing different. That's kind of where any of the work's done, is when you run into that challenge. I think it's all very easy to say that you're rational and you're wise and you're making good calls when everything's fine. But the true test of your character and your kind of register for this will be when you're challenged with the same thing you fell for the last time. That's when you can kind of see if you've grown. So I think, there's we're going story time mode for a second if you don't mind. The story
Yeah,
that I like
please.
most about this is it exists in a couple different folktales all over the world, but the one I was most familiar with came out of China. The idea is there's a farmer um, who has a set of horses who are doing work for him on his farm, and the horses all escape, and all the villagers say, "Oh, what's such a shame? That's awful." And the farmer simply says, "Well, let's wait and see." And then the horses come back and they bring with them extra horses. They found a bunch of wild horses. Now he's got double the amount of horses. Fantastic. The whole village says, great, that's amazing. We've got all this. And the farmer says, no, we'll wait and see. So the farmer's son is out domesticating the horses, breaking them in. And the son falls off and breaks his leg. And the whole village says, oh, what a tragedy. This is awful. And again, the farmer just says, well, we'll wait and see. And then the village is conscripted to go to war, except the son does not have to go because his leg is broken. The village again is celebrating. The farmer just has to wait and see. Point being of this whole story is that there's so much wisdom to simply having that restraint of saying, yes, this looks like a good thing, and we'll wait and see. Yes, this looks like a bad thing, and we'll wait and see. Simply because I think, the position you're talking about when people are anxious and feeling sick all night because they're not sure what's happening with their money, and you've got Warren Buffett on the other end, that's the time when he starts buying things. I think that's the difference between the two. How comfortable are we with not knowing what happens next? And I think this is kind of my point here on psychological flexibility. There's a lot of structures, kind of socially speaking, socioculturally speaking, that make us think that we have the illusion of control, that we have the illusion of certainty. The reality is we don't have any. You
Right.
have no idea if you have no idea. The only certainty we have as humans is that we're going to die. That's it. Depending on how comfortable you are with that, which is an incredibly morbid statement, I think that changes how you handle most things that happen to you in life. It changes how grateful you are for things that happen in life. If you're very attuned to the fact that we're entitled to nothing, and the best we can do is put forward some effort, I think you get a little more comfortable with that maybe. And oddly, maybe ironically, that actually sets you up to take better risks if you're able to get comfy with that.
Well, sure. Yeah, definitely. At the very least, more comfortable with risks and, understood. I can't remember if it was a president or a wartime general or somebody that said, success is never final and failure is never fatal. I can't remember who said it, but as soon as you can adopt that, you
Yeah.
know, I have my own theory about specifically, our profession for the longest time has been scripted around baby boomers. And for two reasons. One, they were the largest cohort, and it's where the most opportunity was for us to help people. But two, I strongly think we get our financial habits from our parents by watching them and learning from them, just like most habits we develop, we get from our parents. Their parents didn't have the 401k. So their parents didn't have to make the choices that they're saddled with right now. So they have no idea how to make these decisions. And we've had many periods of uncertainty in the past, but their parents had their pension, had Social Security. They didn't have to worry about those periods of uncertainty. So this first generation that is funding their retirement is forgive the term, they're lost. They don't know how to deal with the uncertainty. They don't know how to capitalize, if you will, from movements in the market. They are just scared when things happen. And when you're scared, we resort to that baseline. And again, tell me if I'm way off base here. I mean, that's what our brains are conditioned to do. Our brains are conditioned to keep us safe and to save calories. And worrying burns calories. So what do I have to do to not worry? I have to make the completely wrong decision at the wrong time. And then we're happy we did it because we're no longer worried. Okay, the market is down. I'm going to sell out of everything now because it makes me feel comfortable. And I'm relieved that I don't have to worry anymore. Not relieved that I'm going to be more successful. Not relieved that I could potentially profit better. I'm relieved that I don't have to worry anymore. And that's what my brain is telling me. Save the calories, get back to baseline, and don't worry, because they never watched their parents go through that. And, Gen X and forward, to me, is going to be much more, they're going to be conditioned to do one of two things. Either avoid risk altogether or be comfortable when it happens. And I mean, working with both generations as we move forward, that's the reaction we're seeing. I'm always amazed at how conservative, investment minded most young people are. When we know the statistics about market performance, we know the statistics about time being our best friends. They don't care. They don't want the mental anguish of needing to worry about ups and downs.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you mentioned that. There's been a lot of research done around risk taking in younger generations, just generally speaking. So we consider risk taking behaviors to be kind of sensation seeking oriented, all kinds of behaviors, drug taking, drinking, kind of sexual risky behaviors, things like that. Psychologists and sociologists track this all the time.
Sure.
And what they found is there's a drop in that happening at the moment. There's an increase in depression, anxiety from exposure to really terrible things online or whatever, things like that. But in terms of the actual physical behaviors of risk, they're dropping too. In some ways, younger people have become remarkably risk averse, generally speaking.
Yeah.
We see that across the board. And I think one thing you're talking about here too is, and this is probably a bit of a soapbox that I get on too often, but it's contextualized by cultural and global things too. So we are looking at a generation that is also experiencing very, very aggressive loss of faith in any traditional structures. So the idea of having upward mobility, social mobility, the idea they could buy a house when they graduate from college because they'll have a good job, there's a complete loss of faith in that anymore. Okay. So if you lose that sort of positive future orientation outlook, you suddenly become very conservative, because not only do you not know what's going to happen next, but you don't have faith in the institutions that historically granted you the thing that would happen next. So if that's the case, you're kind of on your own out there. And then what? Are you going to just work in a gig economy forever without even an access to 401k? Then why does that even matter? And so we end up with a little bit of a sort of money under the mattress mentality here, where, think about the biblical story about the talents, where I don't know if you're familiar with this at all. There's somebody who has like a lot of money, and he says to his servants, I'm going to give you each a little bit of money. I want you to kind of grow that money. One of the servants, two of them, I think, if I remember this correctly, they go out and they use that money and they seed it somewhere and they invest it and they get returns. They start businesses, they do all this other kind of stuff. One of them's so scared about losing the master's money, he buries it in the ground and just sits on it. So of course it doesn't grow, nothing happens to it, and at the end of the time period, he's got what he's got, but nothing more.
Right.
I think in some ways the generation you're talking about, they are saying, yeah, I'd rather just have what I have. And I think that kind of poses a bit of a problem for everybody. So I definitely see what you're saying. It makes a lot of sense. We're maybe working in an outdated framework. Is that kind of what you're finding?
Yeah. Well, and so I guess my next question is, how do we cultivate that mindset of possibility, of optimism, of bullish mindset and bullish behavior, to use a market term? How do we cultivate that? Because I'm a permeable. I come from a place of, okay, I can create it. I can make it. I can, I'm not worried about having an employer. Now, I've also been my own boss for 22 years now. So I've built the skill set. I have the confidence. I have the headspace that I'm not going to wait for somebody to build it for me to give me that opportunity. I'm going to create it. But it's not easy. So I can understand why folks don't come from that place of, knowing that possibilities are endless and in front of us. But how do we get them there? How do folks push or suppress or steer into and acknowledge and then move forward from and transition that mindset?
Yeah, I think there's two kind of sides of this particular coin. The first one is very individualist, and I think it is that we want to encourage somebody to build resilience through resistance. So sometimes when we run against something that feels like resistance to us, it's like, oh, it's the wrong path, I should go elsewhere. When in reality, resistance, anyone who's tried going to the gym or doing something
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like doing a bench press.
Yeah, it sucks. Nobody wants to do that. Right. But if you're not going to develop that muscle if it never encounters resistance. So you have to build that resistance progressively to get the strength. That's just how it is. And it is in life. If you hit resistance and you go somewhere else, you'll be a different shape. If you hit the resistance and push through, then you get kind of the strength gains from that. So I think building resilience through resistance is one of those things. An individual could work on kind of developing a mindset of possibility rather than just protection. That's important too. Recognizing that any decision that we make in life that's meaningful, whether it's your partner, changing jobs, going back to school, having kids, whatever decision it is, none of those big decisions that have huge gains, I suppose you could put them as, or huge returns, however you want to put that, none of those comes without risk. If you think about the capacity of just a relationship and loving somebody, for example, it's so incredible, being in love, all these kinds of things, having a teammate and all that. And also, the more you invest in that, the riskier it is. You have more to lose. Those things are indivisible. And so finding a way to kind of embrace the mind frame of like possibility and not just protection is helpful. And I think part of that comes down to having self-trust. There has to be a development of self-trust that if things get hard, you'll handle it. If things are ugly, you'll handle it. And so building that self-trust is important. So those are all kind of the individual sort of things I would think about: psychological flexibility, resilience, self-trust. But on the flip side of that, the other way is social. I think this is almost in some ways a more complex question. At the moment, I think there's a real reality that it actually doesn't matter how well you develop all of those things if minimum wage it continues to be what it is, for example, or you can't afford healthcare, or your healthcare is tied to an employment that you can no longer have because people are cutting jobs from firms left, right, and center to outsource and things like that. There are things that are beyond individual control that do directly play into this, and they change the social tenor and sensibility around, is anything possible? And I think maybe I'm saying this as somebody who wasn't raised in the States, but from it as an outside perspective, the States was somewhere where there was opportunity. It's a land of opportunity. It's this wide landscape of kind of being able to do the thing you want to do if you can, if you dream it, you can build it, kind of thing.
Sure.
And I think
and you mentioned the gig economy. I view the world now. My wife and I talk about this all the time. I'm so envious of 20-somethings leaving college right now because, in my opinion, they never have to find an employer, go into a cubicle, and sit from 9 to 5. If they want to grab their iPhone and travel the world, the potential exists to do that and to profit from it and to make themselves their business just by living and videoing themselves living and having, exceptional experiences because we want to watch that. And through things like YouTube and TikTok, the potential is endless to me. Through podcasting, the medium we're using right now, the upside is endless for anybody, whether they go to college and get a degree, whether they go to maybe a guilty pleasure. I shouldn't tell you guilty pleasure, maybe a soothing pleasure. I love watching pressure washing videos of guys pressure washing a driveway it calms me. Who would have thought that a guy could monetize videoing himself pressure washing his driveway? So, jobs that weren't that glamorous are now becoming, multiple business opportunities, not just the payment for pressure washing the driveway, but monetizing YouTube, because folks that are stressed out like me all day want to sit down for a half an hour and watch some guy pressure wash a driveway and is calmed by that. They're monetizing that as well. So the possibilities to me now are much greater than they've ever been. I'm a permeable. I'm always excited looking to the future. But
I think you're talking about different personality gauging. So it's funny you mentioned that, because I have some private practice clients who they are so envious of the email desk job. They express an exhaustion with the online life, because the idea of having to continually present themselves to, everybody's actively selling themselves as labor. That's unavoidable. But to actively have to sell a very manicured version of yourself to put online and really sell yourself to make money, as opposed to kind of have that mediated by an email job. It's interesting. I've heard younger people say, I just want one of those 9-to-5 email jobs with the 401k, because they're so tired of having to present themselves to monetize it. It's so interesting. And I think we'll probably go through pendulum. Everything goes through a swing.
Sure.
We'll probably go back and forward on that, socially speaking. But I think what you're talking about there is the personality. How do we cultivate those particular senses of, because I think what you're talking about there is self-trust. And an interesting thing related to uncertainty is that when we think about, I'm feeling uncertain, I hate it, it's uncomfortable, I don't know what to do next. The type of personality that says, okay, what is the antidote to that? Well, it's certainty. I just need certainty. That kind of personality is going to be lost for a very long time, because if you're oriented in that particular way, you're never going to get certainty. So you're chasing this carrot on a stick that you're just going to get anxious about. If, however, and I think this is related to kind of your positioning here, is if you are uncertain and you embrace the idea that actually the antidote to that is self-trust, to just try your best, do your best, try different things, know how to pick yourself up when you fail. That's a different orientation that's much more successful. It doesn't feel as safe, but it's certainly more successful. And I think, again, this relates back to culture. We have a culture that largely talks about successes and wins, when failure is actually the learning ground for any of this stuff. And so I think we've sort of cherry picked and selected. We're looking at the highlight reel, right? We're looking at somebody's effort and their success. But what we really need to see is the stuff in between, because nobody's getting to it. Well, let me rephrase that. Very few people get to success without some failure on the way.
Right.
And those failures are instructive, they're necessary, they are part of the course. And any idea that you can circumvent that is kind of ridiculous, but understandable given what our culture kind of highlight reels.
Well, and because, and I know we keep referencing Warren Buffett, or I keep referencing Warren Buffett, he hasn't always picked winners every time. I'm sure that he could sit there and talk for hours about the losers he's picked and the mistakes he's made and the errors in judgment and, miscalculations on investments. But nobody asks him that question. Nobody talks to him about that. It's always, this guy is a genius. And he is. He's bright. He's brilliant and is, deserves all those accolades. But I'm sure that he could talk for hours about poor investments, poor companies, bad decisions that they've made, and how they learn from them to not replicate them.
I would love to hear that one. That's something I love about.
So Warren Buffett, if you're listening and want to jump on the Wealth on the Move podcast, please feel free to reach out.
Let's hear about your failures. I do think that's more important. Something that I know Freud gets a lot of, flack for a lot of different things, and he maybe deserved. But one thing I loved about Freud from a psychological perspective is he published his failures. It was so interesting. I think a lot of psychologists in that particular era, they really wanted to establish psychology as a legitimate science. And so they're publishing all the times they win, all the time their interventions work, blah, blah, blah. And Freud comes out and he's continually publishing failures. This didn't work. This didn't work. This might have made this worse, actually. And the interesting part about that to me was that through all those failures, he was able to successfully find a theory at the end that made sense for him. But through the failures, as we read the failures, we can see all the things that we want to avoid doing, the paths to not go down, which is so incredibly helpful and rich. And I think
Yeah.
if we, if we don't want to fail for the sake of failing, but if we fail and learn from it, then was it really a 100% a failure? That's something that's within our control,
Yeah,
and I think that's definitely
absolutely.
part of this resilience building in financial decision making.
Well, I've learned a ton. Hopefully, our listeners have as well, and can't wait to have you back on at some point to talk about how all of this is developing and moving forward, and maybe pinpoint some more exact scenarios as the markets move, as our money moves. I mean, that's why it's called Wealth on the Move, because it's never standing still, and it's never
Yeah.
stagnant, and it's never the same. We do have some rapid fire questions for you, if you're okay answering that.
Yeah.
With multiple backgrounds, as you've dove into the financial aspect and the behavioral psychology of finance, what's now one financial habit that you always swear by?
Automation.
Okay.
Automate whatever you can. Just set and forget.
Okay.
I think that our brains have to make so many decisions in a day. Our ancient brains were only set to make, a certain number of decisions a day, and we're using those ancient brains in a culture now where we make a bajillion decisions a day, and we're
Right.
overloaded. It's a lot, and especially if you have children. I don't know if you want to phrase it as mental load or psychological stress, whatever you want to phrase it as. There are so many decisions to make.
Sure.
So, in terms of finances, if you decide that you want a particular kind of future, which requires a certain amount of material security, I think automating what I can automate is great. It just disappears from my account, goes somewhere, and I don't have to think about it before I do anything else.
Genius. What's one myth about money and uncertainty that you would want to bust?
I think maybe it's not a myth per se, but I think I do run into people who think certainty is a possibility. And I think if there is a myth in there somewhere, I would like to bust the fact that literally nothing other than our own death is certain, nothing at all. And so to pursue certainty is almost the same as pursuing an increased probability of failure. It's the wrong thing, it's the wrong target to aim at. If we get some certainty as a byproduct by the decisions that we choose to make, great. But if it's the thing that we're gunning for, we're already on a losing track. So I think if any time that you find yourself pursuing certainty is the focal point, we're maybe
The
on the
fool's
wrong
errand.
one. Yeah, fool's errand, exactly.
What's your go-to book?
Oh, honestly, my go-to book is probably there's a professor out of Vermont who teaches, I think, English and film called Todd McGowan,
Say that
and I
again.
think there's a professor called. It's not behavioral finance. I mean,
Okay, that's okay.
his name is Todd McGowan.
Okay.
He's written some incredible books, but he wrote one called "Embracing Alienation" fairly recently, and I think it's a really interesting take on the relationship between community, what is communal, individualism in America, and it's just an interesting kind of take. But it's somewhat kind of a psychological text. That would be my rec right now because I've been rereading it.
I'll have to add it to my list.
Yeah, it's
All
good.
right. Now, and something that, and unfortunately, I hadn't done it on our last two guests. Shame on me, but I have totally copped this from the Diary of a CEO podcast. I think he does something interesting to tie all his guests together in some way, and he asks every guest a question from his previous guests, and then you're going to have the opportunity to ask our next guest, and we don't know who it is yet,
Okay.
a question for them. So Mike Kavanaugh, who is a side hustle coach, was our last guest to be able to ask a question. And his question was, when was the moment that you figured out what you were supposed to be doing on planet Earth?
Maybe I haven't hit that yet. I don't know.
I had the same
It's a good
answer. I'll
question.
let him know when I get
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, no, exactly. I also wonder if maybe that's fine. And maybe my answer to that would be the moving target. I think that's how I'm kind of geared. I think at some point I recognized that it was given my particular constellation of values. I think there was a moment of reckoning where I recognized I wouldn't be able to do anything that didn't engage with trying to alleviate some suffering somewhere. So I suppose that's as close as
Okay.
I can get with that one. I really don't have a clear answer for that. I mean, I think I like the freedom of knowing that I can answer that question in a different way every couple of years.
Sure.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. And what is your question that you would love to ask our next guest?
So I think we're talking about uncertainty. I suppose the context here is when we're experiencing emotions, thinking of them as teachers and what they can teach us is something that I find interesting. In fact, I just asked this question of a friend over the weekend. I think my question would be, what are you most scared of losing? Because when we experience uncertainty, the real thing happening there is it puts something, we're scared of losing something to uncertainty.
Sure.
So I guess related to that, I'd be curious to know what your next guest says about what they're scared of losing.
Okay. Can't wait to ask. Make sure you tune in and listen.
Yeah.
And then one final question. If someone is feeling financially uncertain right now, what is one thing you would tell them to do immediately today to acknowledge and take care of that feeling of uncertainty?
One thing. Can I cheat and do three?
Sure.
Okay. I think first thing, recognize that's what's happening. Recognize
Okay.
you're feeling stressed. Second thing, I want to think about this in terms of skyscrapers in Japan or somewhere where you might have an earthquake. We're going to think about shifting from the reaction, the impulse is uncertainty, the stimulus is uncertainty, sorry. The reaction is a desire for control. We want to have that really solid base like those skyscrapers, but we need to have flexibility, otherwise the rigidity would just break. So we need to figure out our goals. We need to shift from that obsession of control into a goal kind of oriented mindset, remind ourselves of our goals, make sure the goals are set. Are we still contributing to the things we can? Are we still kind of saving in the ways that we know are optimal? Are we still diversified? Those are all the things we know will serve us. Do those things. Everything else is going to be flexible, I think, from there. And then I think lastly, there would be re-explore all the options. Something that psychologically brings down anxiety is to just make sure we map the entire topography again. Look at all those options again. Just knowing you have options can help you feel less stressed. And then pick the ones again that align with your goals. And maybe you're just revisiting the plan that you made in the first place, but just simply going through all those options again, even the really stupid ones, the really risky ones, the really conservative ones, go through them all again, just because it will lower your anxiety. And then refocus in on the plan you made initially. Maybe you need a couple tweaks in the areas where you can be flexible. But if your plan reflects your goals, then revisiting that will bring a sense of calm as well.
I love that Japanese skyscraper analogy. We're in a process of remodeling and redesigning our office a bit, and now I want a piece of art in our office that has skyscrapers in Japan to make that reference to. That's a brilliant analogy.
You can't predict the earthquake, but you do need a little bit of flexibility to get through when that happens. The idea of having a very rigid structure would be quite scary in that situation.
Yes. Well, Dr. Win, thank you so much for joining us. I know I've learned a ton. Hopefully our listeners have as well. If they wanted to connect or follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Honestly, I do have a limited presence. I think I am on LinkedIn somewhere,
Yes.
but sending an email through Orion would probably be the most direct way to make sure my attention has been got.
Okay. Well, that is all we have today from the Wealth on the Move the podcast. Make sure you follow us. We are active on LinkedIn, Facebook. Our website, hoffmanwealth.com, is the best way to reach us if you do have a specific question. I'm very active on LinkedIn under Will Hoffman. But until next time, make sure you keep your wealth moving.
Thank you.